I'd like to just dig a little bit deeper into it. Science fantasy. What is science
Mm.
fantasy, and how is it different from science fiction?
So it's funny. When I first started writing, I figured science fiction was just science fiction, pew pew lasers. That's it. I was I was told afterward by some reviewers that that is not the case. It's like a gradient. Like it goes
Yeah,
from hard to light sci-fi, right? And I put science fantasy at that light end of the whole gradient. Right. Whereas hard sci-fi would be something more like The Expanse. A lot of military sci-fi falls into hard sci-fi where it's got a lot more reality to it, right? Science fantasy and light fantasy, we're gonna have, for lack of a better term, more fun. Like we're just gonna like play with. It might not happen, and there might be no physical way this could ever happen. To bring it to something everybody knows, Star Wars is science fantasy. Even Dune is science fantasy because it just has, which is interesting because it doesn't feel like it. But then you're like, well, giant
yeah,
sandworms, and then the mentats and the way spaceships work and spice and all that. It actually pulls it into science fantasy. Star Wars, you got laser swords, zappy guns, the Force, kind of stuff like that. Same with mine are still they're science fantasy, but I would still put them a little edged out of what Star Wars is, because I do try to give you a little bit of that, like, okay, this could happen in reality. Like the way spaceships kind of work. It works the
okay,
same. Like I try to keep that real. And when they're up in space and they're not on anything that's specific, they might be in zero gravity and stuff like
hmm,
that. And I understand how like Newtonian physics and stuff work, but I try to keep that as light as possible. But it is there
yeah,
sometimes.
okay,
Depending on the book. Like I said, Down Below Beyond, less so, because I just wanted to go nuts. I wanted to just have a fun sci-fi adventure romp, through the galaxy. There's a lot of somebody described them as rubber suited aliens, like they're people at a movie set wearing just a rubber. And I'm like, you know what? Yeah, sure, some of them are. I mean, there's one that's like
right,
a giant tick, like a bug. That definitely could not be a dude in a suit. But like
right.
for the most part, yeah, we're having fun here. Like would they
Yeah,
all evolve that way? No, not at all. Yeah, my Song of Kamaria trilogy is a little bit harder about that stuff. So I feel like there are people that have picked up my books that were expecting a harder sci-fi than I delivered. I try to make it really upfront too. Like in the beginning of Down Below Beyond, he fights a giant crab thing. Like I hope that sets the tone, so I try to establish that, and I do label them as science fantasy. I do feel like I have managed to find an audience that loves fantasy and wants to dip their toes into sci-fi, but like
yeah.
hasn't found the right book. And I've described it as like a gateway drug to sci-fi, and I kind of do write it in that way.